I swear I'm never touching that app again. Not after what happened last Thursday. So there I was, bored out of my mind after another soul-crushing day of remote work. When I remembered, I still had Randonautica on my phone. I downloaded it months ago during that whole TikTok craze, but never actually used it. My intention was simple. I just wanted to find something interesting. Maybe a cool photo spot or some weird piece of local history I'd never noticed before. The coordinates popped up about 15 minutes from my apartment, which seemed perfect. Not too far to walk and not too close to be boring. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and headed out into the late afternoon sun. The GPS led me through some neighborhoods I'd never really explored, past strip malls and residential streets that all looked the same. But then I turned down this access road I'd probably driven past 100 times without noticing. And there it was. This massive, hulking train station that looked like it had been frozen in time. The building was this beautiful old brick structure, probably built in the 1920s or something, with these tall arched windows and decorative stonework. But man, had it seen better days. Paint was peeling everywhere. Half the windows were boarded up or broken, and weeds were growing up through cracks in the platform concrete. The whole place had that sad, abandoned look that made you wonder how something so grand could just be left to rot. I stood there for a few minutes, checking my phone. The coordinates were definitely pointing inside the building. I looked around for no trespassing signs or a fence, but there was nothing. The main entrance was wide open, just these heavy wooden doors hanging slightly ajar. Part of me wanted to turn around right then. I'm not usually the type to go exploring abandoned buildings, but something about the place pulled me in. Maybe it was the randonauting spirit, or maybe I was just desperate for something to break up the monotony of my week. Either way, I went inside, and it was more impressive than the outside. This huge main terminal with a vaulted ceiling that must have been 30 feet high, covered in decades of grime and graffiti. Old wooden benches sat scattered around, some overturned and others just sitting there, like they were still waiting for passengers who would never come. Shafts of dusty sunlight streamed through the broken windows, creating these dramatic light patterns across the cracked tile floor. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The place was like a time capsule. There were still old schedule boards on the walls, though most of the letters had fallen off. A few ancient vending machines stood guard in the corners, their glass fronts spider-webbed with cracks. Everything was covered in this fine layer of dust and debris, like the building had been holding its breath for decades. The more I explored, the more fascinated I became. I found old ticket windows with their brass fixtures still intact, and what looked like a former restaurant or cafe area with vintage light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. My phone was filling up with photos. This place was an urban explorer's dream. I made my way to the back of the station, following what used to be the main corridor toward the platform areas. The coordinates were pulling me deeper into the building, past doorways that led to dark rooms I didn't want to investigate. The afternoon light was starting to fade, casting longer shadows through the broken windows. That's when I heard the voices. At first I thought maybe it was just another urban explorer, or maybe maintenance workers. But something about the tone made me stop. These weren't casual conversation voices. There was tension there, with anger building. I crept closer to where the sound was coming from, staying low and trying to move quietly across the debris-covered floor. Through a gap in some old wooden barrels, I could see across to what used to be another platform area. 3 guys were standing in a circle, and even from a distance, I could tell it wasn't a friendly chat. Their body language was all wrong. Aggressive postures, pointing fingers, getting in each other's faces. My heart started pounding. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I knew if I ran, they would see me. All I could do was crouch behind some old metal barrels and concrete barriers. I couldn't make out most of what was said, but I caught fragments. They were talking about numbers, complaints about quality, and threats about payment. Then one of them shoved another guy hard, and suddenly fists were flying. I pressed myself further back behind the barrels, trying to become invisible. The sound of the scuffle echoed through the empty station. Grunts, the impact of punches, and someone hitting the ground. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, though the last thing I was thinking about was taking pictures. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes or two, the fighting stopped. I heard them talking again, calmer now but still tense. There were more numbers, what sounded like negotiations. Someone mentioned meeting again next week. Then footsteps, moving away toward what I assumed was another exit. I stayed crouched behind those barrels for another 10 minutes, maybe 15, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat and the occasional creak of the old building settling. When I was finally convinced they were gone, I slowly stood up and looked around. The platform area across from me was empty now, just shadows and debris. I didn't stick around to investigate further. Whatever I witnessed, it definitely wasn't legal, and it definitely wasn't something I wanted to get mixed up in. The whole thing had that unmistakable feeling of a drug deal. The secrecy, the location, the arguing over prices and quality, and the violence when things went sideways. I practically sprinted back through the station, not caring any more about being quiet or careful. All I wanted was to get out of there and back to the safety of busy streets and normal people. I burst through those front doors like the building was on fire, and didn't stop moving until I was 6 blocks away. The walk home felt like it took forever. Every car that passed, every person I encountered, I wondered if they were connected to what I'd seen. My paranoia was probably ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have. By the time I got back to my apartment, I'd convinced myself to just forget the whole thing. I deleted the photos I'd taken, uninstalled Randonautica, and spent the rest of the evening binge-watching Netflix, trying to pretend none of it had happened. But I can't stop thinking about it. Not the drug deal or whatever criminal activity I witnessed, but the coincidence of it all. I mean, what are the odds that some app would send me to that exact spot at that exact time? I keep telling myself it was just bad luck, wrong place at the wrong time. Still, I'm not going to risk walking in on something like that again. You know how sometimes you and your friends do something stupid, and it turns into the kind of story you'll be telling for years? Well, this is one of those stories, except we're probably never going to tell anyone else about it. It started last Saturday when Jake suggested we try randonauting together. The four of us, me, Jake, Sarah, and Marcus, had been hanging out at Sarah's place, complaining about how boring her town was getting. Jake had been obsessed with Randonautica videos on YouTube and kept insisting we try it as a group. Sarah rolled her eyes at first, but eventually we all agreed to beat sitting around doing nothing. We decided to set our intention as adventure. Pretty basic, but we figured it was our first time and we didn't want to get too weird with it. The app gave us coordinates about 20 minutes away at Riverside Park, which was perfect since it was a nice day and we'd been cooped up inside all morning. Riverside Park is one of those typical small-town parks. A few picnic tables, some playground equipment that's seen better days, and a little stream that runs along the back edge before disappearing into the woods. We'd been there countless times as kids, but hadn't really hung out there since high school. The coordinates led us toward the back of the park, past the picnic areas, and toward the tree line where the stream curved away from the main park area. It's pretty dense back there, Lots of old oak trees and thick underbrush that the town never bothers to maintain. We had to push through some overgrown bushes and step carefully around logs to get to the exact spot. Marcus was the one who spotted it first. This small plastic container wedged between two rocks, right at the base of a big maple tree. It looked exactly like a geocache container, the kind treasure hunters hide all over the place for people to find. Sarah got excited immediately because she'd done some geocaching with her family when she was younger. We gathered around as Jake opened it up, expecting to find the usual geocache contents. Maybe a logbook to sign, some small trinkets, that kind of thing. Instead, there was just a folded piece of paper with what looked like instructions written in block letters. The note was weird. Instead of normal geocaching language, it had these cryptic directions about going to the lot behind Miller's Hardware and looking for the third post from the south corner. There was also a sequence of numbers that didn't mean anything to us at the time. Sarah thought it might be part of some elaborate multi-cache setup, where you have to visit several locations to complete the puzzle. Those are pretty popular with serious geocachers. The rest of us were just curious enough to go along with it. Plus, we had nothing better to do. Miller's Hardware is downtown, one of those old family businesses that's been around forever. The parking lot behind it is mostly used by employees, but it backs up to an empty field, so it's not heavily monitored. We parked Sarah's car on the street and walked around back, trying to look casual. The third post from the south corner turned out to be a fence post along the back edge of the lot. Marcus found another small container tucked behind it, hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. This one had another note, with more directions, this time sending us to what sounded like a location on the edge of town, near the old grain elevator. That's when things started feeling less like geocaching, and more like something else entirely. The instructions were getting more specific and more paranoid, telling us to approach from a certain direction, to make sure we weren't followed, and to look for a package under a specific landmark. Jake was getting uncomfortable and suggested we head back, but Sarah was determined to see where this led. The location turned out to be this abandoned access road that used to serve the grain elevator before it was shut down years ago. It's pretty isolated out there, just overgrown fields and a few scattered farm buildings. We had to park on the main road and walk about a quarter mile down this rutted dirt path. The final cache was hidden under a concrete culvert, where the road crosses a drainage ditch. But when Sarah pulled it out, we immediately knew we'd made a huge mistake. This wasn't a geocaching container. It was a waterproof bag containing 2 handguns and a box of ammunition. The silence that followed was probably the longest 10 seconds of my life. We all just stared at these weapons, trying to process what we'd stumbled into. This wasn't some elaborate treasure hunt or art project. We'd followed instructions meant for someone else. Probably someone involved in something very illegal. Marcus was the first one to speak, and he basically said what we were all thinking. We needed to get out of there immediately and call the police. Nobody argued. Sarah carefully put the bag back exactly where we'd found it, and we practically jogged back to the car. We drove to the police station in complete silence. Sarah did the talking when we got there, explaining that we'd been geocaching and found what appeared to be hidden weapons. The desk sergeant took down our information and said they'd send someone to investigate. They called Sarah back a few days later to let her know they'd recovered the weapons and were investigating, but they never asked us to come back in or give additional statements. As far as we know, they never connected it to anyone specific. The guns are probably sitting in some evidence locker now, and whoever was supposed to pick them up is either panicking or has moved to a different hiding spot. The whole experience left us pretty shaken up. We'd gone looking for adventure and ended up accidentally intercepting what was probably some kind of illegal arms deal or weapons drop. The coordination required multiple hidden locations, specific instructions, waterproof storage, suggested this wasn't some amateur operation. What really gets to me is thinking about the timing. If we'd shown up a few hours later, we might have encountered whoever was supposed to collect those guns. Or worse, if they'd shown up while we were there, following their instructions around town. We could have been mistaken for competitors or informants. None of us have used Randonautica since then. Maybe it was just a coincidence that the coordinates led us to that spot. But it's hard not to wonder if there's something more going on with that app than anyone realizes. Either way, we learned that some adventures aren't worth having. And sometimes boring Saturday afternoons are exactly what you need. We had heard of the Randonautica app before, back when it was popular. But we were both in college then and too busy with other stuff to care about some random coordinate app. Fast forward to this past March, and we're both working dead-end jobs, living in the same crappy apartment complex, and desperately looking for something to break up the routine. Connor downloaded it on a Tuesday evening, while we were hanging out at my place, scrolling through our phones, and complaining about how there was nothing to do in our town. He kept insisting it would be fun, that we needed to get out and explore instead of just sitting around playing video games every night. I figured it couldn't be worse than another evening of the same old stuff, so I agreed to give it a shot. We set our intention as mystery because Connor thought it sounded cooler than just asking for something interesting. The app took a few minutes to generate coordinates, then sent us to an address about 15 minutes across town, in an area I'd driven through but never really explored. According to the GPS, it was taking us to what used to be the Lincoln Elementary School. The school had been abandoned for at least 10 years, maybe longer. Budget cuts had forced the district to consolidate, and this old brick building had been sitting empty ever since. It was one of those 1960s institution buildings, long and low with big windows and that particular shade of brown brick that screams government construction. We parked across the street and checked out the perimeter. The whole place was surrounded by a chain link fence that was maybe 6 feet tall, topped with a few strands of barbed wire that had seen better days. Most of the windows were boarded up, and there was graffiti covering pretty much every accessible surface. The grass and weeds had grown up around the building, giving it that post-apocalyptic look that abandoned places get after a few years of neglect. Connor spotted the hole in the fence first, a section where someone had cut through the chain link fence and pulled it back, creating an opening just big enough for a person to squeeze through. It wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it either. We stood there for a minute, checking to see if there were any security cameras or signs warning about alarms. There were none that we could see. The way Connor saw it, if whoever owned the property cared enough to keep people out, they would have fixed the fence by now. That made sense to me, and the coordinates were definitely pointing somewhere inside the building. We squeezed through the gap and made our way across the overgrown playground toward the main entrance. The front doors were chained shut, but there was a side entrance where someone had pried off the plywood covering one of the windows. We climbed through into what used to be a classroom. The place smelled like mold and old paint, with that musty odor that abandoned buildings get when moisture and time work together to slowly destroy everything inside. Inside was pretty much what you'd expect from an abandoned elementary school. Broken desks scattered around empty classrooms, old bulletin boards with faded papers still tacked to them, ceiling tiles that had fallen and shattered on the floor. The hallways were covered in graffiti, some of it decent art, but most of it just tags and random profanity. Our footsteps echoed weirdly in the empty corridors, and every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. We spent maybe 20 minutes exploring the main hallway and checking out different classrooms, Connor was taking pictures with his phone, and I was mostly just following along, trying to shake the creepy feeling that abandoned places always give me. There's something unsettling about seeing a place that used to be full of kids and teachers and normal daily activity sitting completely empty and decaying. The coordinates kept pulling us deeper into the building, toward what the faded directory signs indicated was the cafeteria. We had to navigate around some debris in the hallway, chunks of ceiling tile, broken glass, and an old filing cabinet someone had apparently pushed over for no reason. The further we went in, the darker it got, since fewer windows meant less natural light filtering in. When we finally reached the cafeteria, Connor pushed open the double doors, and we both just stopped dead. The room was set up like it was still in use, except everything was wrong. There were maybe 30 or 40 teddy bears sitting in the plastic chairs around the lunch tables, all facing the same direction like they were waiting for something. In front of each bear was a plastic lunch tray with what looked like it had once been food, but now it was just moldy, unidentifiable masses of decay. The bears themselves were in various states of disrepair. Some looked relatively new, others were missing eyes or limbs, and a few were so dirty and worn they were barely recognizable as stuffed animals. They were arranged with an almost obsessive attention to detail, each one positioned carefully in its chair, each tray placed precisely in front of them. The smell in that room was unbelievable. The combination of mold, decay, and whatever other organic matter had been festering in those trays created an odor that hit you like a physical force. Connor covered his nose with his shirt and took one step back toward the door. I was already retreating, trying not to breathe through my nose. We both had the same immediate reaction. This wasn't just some random vandalism or kids messing around. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating the scene, and whoever it was clearly had some serious issues. The whole setup felt ritualistic, like we'd stumbled into someone's private shrine or ceremony space. Connor managed to snap one quick photo before we both decided we'd seen enough. We turned around and headed back toward the hallway, moving faster than we had on the way in. The teddy bear cafeteria had completely changed the vibe of our exploration, from curiosity to unease. We were almost back to the main hallway when we heard it. A loud crash from behind us, like something heavy falling over or being knocked down. The sound echoed through the empty building, and we both immediately knew it had come from the cafeteria we just left. Neither of us said anything. We didn't discuss whether it might have been a settling building, or an animal, or whatever. We just ran. Connor was ahead of me, navigating around the debris in the hallway, and making straight for the window we'd climbed through. I was right behind him, not bothering to look back or slow down until we were outside the building and heading for the hole in the fence. We didn't stop running until we reached Connor's car. Even then, we sat there for a minute catching our breath. Connor started the engine and we drove home in relative silence, both of us processing what we'd seen and heard. The weird thing is, despite how creeped out we both were, we couldn't stop talking about it over the next few days. There was something addictive about the whole experience. The mystery, the adrenaline, the sense that we discovered something nobody else knew about. We haven't deleted the app yet, and we keep talking about trying it again. Maybe that's the strangest part of all this. You'd think finding a room full of teddy bears arranged like some twisted tea party would put you off urban exploration forever. But somehow it's made us more curious about what else might be out there, waiting to be discovered. Saturday mornings used to be chaos. Pancakes, cartoons, and my two kids bouncing off the walls. But this particular Saturday, the house was dead silent. Emma and Tyler were spending the weekend with their dad, and my date had texted me at 10 in the morning to cancel because something came up at work. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, staring at a completely empty day stretching ahead of me. That's when I remembered Randonautica was still buried somewhere in my phone. I had downloaded it a couple years back, when the kids were wanting to do things out of the house. We'd used it a few times back then, found a cool mural downtown, discovered a little park we'd never noticed, that kind of thing. Nothing too exciting, but the kids had loved the adventure aspect. I figured it beat spending another Saturday reorganizing closets or binge-watching Netflix shows I'd already seen twice. My intention was simple. I wanted to find something peaceful, maybe a nice spot for some alone time in nature. The coordinates came back pointing to Millbrook Trail, about 20 minutes outside of town. That sounded perfect. Millbrook Trail is one of those local hiking spots that everyone knows about, but not many people actually visit regularly. It's got decent parking and well-marked paths, popular with weekend warriors and dog walkers. I'd been there a handful of times over the years, usually with the kids when they were going through their outdoor adventure phases. The trailhead was busier than I expected for a Saturday morning. A few other cars in the parking area, some serious-looking hikers with their poles and water packs, and a couple with their golden retriever. It felt safe and normal, which was exactly what I needed after the week I'd had. The main trail follows Millbrook Creek for the first mile or so, winding through a mix of pine and oak trees that create nice shade, even on sunny days. I'd forgotten how much I actually enjoyed hiking when I wasn't constantly worried about keeping the kids on the path or entertained. There's something meditative about the rhythm of walking and the sound of running water that just clears your head. I was about a mile in when I checked my phone and realized the coordinates were pulling me away from the main trail. There was a smaller path, barely more than a game trail, that branched off to the right and headed up a steeper slope. I hesitated for a minute. This was definitely getting into less maintained territory, but I could still hear other hikers on the main path behind me, and the coordinates were only showing maybe another quarter mile. The smaller trail was tougher going, more roots and rocks, steeper inclines, and the tree cover was thick enough that it felt significantly darker, even though it was still mid-morning. I had to watch my footing more carefully, and a couple of times I had to push through low-hanging branches that hadn't been trimmed back like they would be on the main trails. After about 15 minutes of climbing, I reached a small clearing where the coordinates seemed to be pointing. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just a natural opening in the trees where some old pine had probably fallen years ago. But then I noticed the structure tucked back against the far tree line. It was a small shack, maybe 8 feet square, built from weathered plywood and scrap lumber. Definitely not any kind of official park structure. This was something someone had constructed illegally on state land. The roof was partially caved in, and the whole thing looked like it had been there for several years at least. My first instinct was to turn around and head back to the main trail. Unauthorized structures in the wood usually mean either homeless camps or drug activity, neither of which I wanted to encounter alone. But curiosity got the better of me, and the place looked abandoned enough that I figured a quick look wouldn't hurt. The door was just a piece of plywood on hinges, hanging partly open. I pushed it wider and peered inside, expecting to see camping gear or trash, or maybe evidence of drug use. Instead, what I found was much more disturbing. The interior walls were covered with symbols that I initially mistook for graffiti, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized these weren't random tags or artwork. They were markings in geometric patterns, strange lettering that didn't look like any alphabet I recognized, and what appeared to be crude drawings of animals and human figures. In the center of the small space was what could only be described as an altar. Someone had stacked flat stones to create a raised platform about 3 feet square, and arranged smaller rocks around it in a star-shaped pattern. The whole setup had that unmistakable feeling of ritualistic purpose, like I was looking at someone's private worship space. That's when I noticed the bones. Small animal skeletons were scattered around the base of the stone altar. What looked like squirrels, maybe some birds, and other creatures I couldn't immediately identify. Some were obviously old, bleached white by time and weather, but others looked more recent. The bones weren't just randomly scattered either. They'd been arranged in specific patterns around the stones. My stomach turned, and suddenly the enclosed space felt suffocating. I backed out of the shack quickly, not wanting to spend another second looking at whatever ritual site I'd stumbled across. The symbols on the walls, the carefully constructed altar, the arranged animal remains, it all added up to something I definitely didn't want to understand or investigate further. I made it back to the main trail in record time, practically jogging down the steep game path and not slowing down until I could hear other hikers' voices again. The normal sounds of families and casual hikers felt incredibly reassuring after what I'd just discovered. The drive home gave me time to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was just some weird art project, or maybe teenagers trying to create something spooky for social media. But the deliberate construction, the age of some of those bone arrangements, and the serious effort that had gone into creating that space suggested something much more committed and long-term. I keep telling myself it was just a bizarre coincidence that Randonautica led me to that particular spot. Random coordinates generated by quantum processes shouldn't have any connection to hidden ritual sites in the woods. But the alternative explanations, that the app somehow knew about that place, or that I was unconsciously drawn there for reasons I don't understand, are even more unsettling. Either way, I've decided to give the app a break for a while. When I do use it again, I'm sticking to coordinates that lead to populated areas, parks with other people around, downtown locations, places where the worst thing I might discover is an interesting mural or a coffee shop I haven't tried yet. Some adventures aren't worth having, especially when you're exploring alone and stumble across evidence that someone else has been using the wilderness for purposes you really don't want to think about too deeply. You have been watching Noir, a Radeon production brought to you by Trapper Dan, the finest in canned survival food.